What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and we're back for another episode of the Super Smash Brothers Platform Fighter tutorial series. In today's episode, we are going to be going over moving our bindings for our input actions and input axes to the player controller. And the reason we want to do this is that we can navigate things like our menus through the player controller using inputs that we bind without ruining the inputs that we have on our character, because we successfully created our pause menu and we're able to spawn it. We don't have everything updating on the menu yet, but it is receiving the inputs. However, I've lost my ability to jump because of that. And that is because of the way our inputs are set up between our character and our player controller. If we are to move all of our input bindings and capturing of inputs to our player controller, we can easily resolve this issue, and our system becomes more robust and easier to expand. So today's episode is just going to be transferring those inputs from the character to the player controller and showing you how you can split these things up, the benefits of that, and some additional cleanup along the way. Now, before we hop into this episode, if you're interested in getting caught up in the entire series, if you like the idea of seeing a platform fighter with sudden death, launch mechanics, chargeable attacks, and a whole lot more, feel free to check out the entire platform fighter tutorial series, which I'll show you right here in the top right corner. Alternatively, if you don't care about that and you only care about the player controller and capturing inputs in there, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to watch the entire series to follow along with this. I do recommend that you watch the pause menu episode before this. That way you know that your logic is working, that you followed the episode fully, because putting the inputs in the player controller should work, but we want to make sure that it works for both the character or the possessed pawn and also other things in our game, such as our menus. With that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. So this is a code and blueprint tutorial series. We're going to be doing just about everything in the code today, as that's where all of our bindings are. So we can go there right away. Specifically, I want to go to my base PlayerController.cpp. In here I have my setup input component function, and this is where we bind all of our inputs. So we take the name of the action mapping, or the input action, or the input axis, or if you're doing enhanced input, it's a very similar method as well, and we call a corresponding function. So in the case of the pause menu, we have our start input logic, which right now only supports the pause menu, but we could do other things with the start input if we want. This spawns it, adds it to the viewport, all that good stuff. And then we also have menu up, menu down, menu left, menu right, which are handled by the widget navigation interface. So basically we can call events on those widgets or on those menus if they inherit or implement that interface. But we can also control our possessed pawn or our character in here. To this point in the series, our SSB template character, which is our base character, has been what is capturing all the inputs for the character. And you can see this in our setup player input component function. We have our jump, our crouch, our debug take damage, our basic attack, special attack, grab, block, taunt, exit revival platform, and move right controller. Now we can keep all the functions we have in the character. So for example, move right. Move right is something that this character or this pawn happens to do when the move right input is pressed. However, we may want to be able to possess a different pawn that has their own version of move right. For example, if we're no longer one of our main characters and instead we swap to a side character, or if we can control some item in the game or something like that. The move right logic could be completely different. The player controller will call the move right function on the corresponding possessed pawn, which might not be an SSB template character. So one controller can be used to possess multiple entities and still perform the correct logic based on user input. But to do this properly, we need to move over these bindings to the player controller. The easiest way to do this is just to copy these outright and bring them over. So I'm going to copy everything and set up player input component for my SSB template character and just go to base PlayerController.cpp and paste them here. The difference here is we don't have the player input component passed in like we do for the SSB template character. It is just part of player controllers. So instead of player input component, input component. Now the other thing we need to do to make this work is make functions in the player controller to trigger this. We should have our own functions in the player controller that call the corresponding functions on the pawn. We don't have to call them things like start jump and stop jump if we don't want to. We can just call this like press up, press down. You could also call it start jump or call jump or whatever. That does work, but just keep in mind it does not need to be that way. So we can just make void press up if we want to. Mimic the comments above, so handle logic that occurs when the up input is pressed. And then if we go back into setup input component in the bind action jump on the press, we can simply type ampersand a base player controller, : press up. We need to fill out the logic for this function, but let's go ahead and make all of our functions first for these bindings. Next one is to release jump. So if we come in here, and I'm just going to copy this and paste it, change the comment to handle logic that occurs when the up input is released. And we will say release up. Then we want to call this here. So a base player controller, : release up. And we want to do the same thing for press down and release down, or start crouch and stop crouch. So just change these comments to down. And change the names of the function to press down and release down. Same as before, change the class to a base player controller, and then press up and release up. Now, debug take damage is a special one. It's what it sounds like. It is a debug function to be able to add damage arbitrarily to a character. This is perfectly fine to keep. It's pretty useful for debugging. If you don't intend to use this, you don't need to make a variable for it or make a function for it, so you could take it out. But if you want to, we can just copy one of these. And I forget what it's actually bound to at the moment. If we go to Edit Project Settings Input, we can find out. So debug take damage is bound to the insert key. Change this function to press insert. Change the comment and change the function here. Now these other ones are for pressing and releasing our types of attacks: basic attack and special attack. Things like this, since this is a specific action, I'm just going to say the basic attack input is pressed and basic attack input is released. Because if you change the input, if the player changes the mappings, it's not always going to be the same key. The press basic attack, release basic attack. And we can copy this for special attack. So just change the comment to special attack, and then change the function names, press special attack and release special attack. Then change all these functions out. So press basic attack. And this is called basic smash attack, but I'm just going to call it release basic attack for the player controller, and then press special attack and release special attack. Then we have grab, which only has a press right now. So when the grab input is pressed, press grab. And same thing here. Start blocking and stop blocking. So press and release for this. When the block input is pressed, and press block, just press block, that works, and then release block. Same thing here. Then we have our taunt, and this only has a press right now. So when the taunt input is pressed, and press taunt. Okay, then we have exit revival platform. And this one is actually bound to any key, if I recall correctly. It's just basically if the user presses any input, we want to leave the platform. Let's double check this. And it is. So this is a case where we could actually say any input is pressed. We can call this press any input. Then we have our axes, which technically this comment says bind input actions to functions. So if we want to be completely correct here, we should say bind input axes to functions. And then we can do this just like we do any other one, but these ones also need the axis value. So we'll say handle logic that occurs based on left, right axis values. Because if we press or move our stick or touch on our keyboard to change whether we're moving left or right or not moving at all, that axis value is always being read. Capture right axis. We could call it whatever we want as long as we understand what it's doing. Capture right axis sounds pretty good. Capture right axis, A base player controller. And this move right controller is just if we want to have different logic for moving right. Since we have it in the series, I will support it. But I'm going to call this capture right axis controller. We'll say controller axis values. There we go. So now all of our functions have been bound. We need to add the value for these axes like I was telling you about. So if we go to SSB template character, you look at move right, it has float value, and move right controller also has float value. So going back to base player controller, we need to add float value and float value. Then go back to base player controller CPP and you'll see that these are all bound successfully. So now we just need to create all of these functions and define them in the CPP file. So if we come down here, void a base player controller, : press up. It's the first one. And I'll just go ahead and make all these first. Again, we have quite a few of them. Press down. This should be press down and release down. Almost made a mistake there. Down, add these, release up, release down. Then we have our press insert and our attacks. So next one would be press insert, press basic attack, release basic attack, press special attack, release special attack. Then we have press grab, press block, release block. And we can do release block. And don't forget grab, press grab. I believe the next one is taunt. Press taunt. Press any input. Let's make sure we're not missing them, right? Grab, block, block, taunt, press any input, and then our two axes. So capture right axis and capture right axis controller. These ones are only slightly different because they take in that parameter. So void a base player controller : capture right axis float value. And void a base player controller : capture right axis controller float value. So now all of our functions are made, and this is good because now we can call them. They're already bound, so they will be called when the inputs are pressed. In SSB template character, we can now go in and remove all of these. Now, we did have a check in here to check and make sure that the game mode players array did not have a valid index of 0. The reason we were checking for this is because we support keyboard mode, where one character is really controlling all of these individual characters. With some hacky logic we set up just to support one input device controlling more characters. We do have ways we could get around this, but for the simplicity of this episode, it's not really part of the topic. You could just copy this and put it in the base player controller up here. We'll comment it out for now, and we'll test it at the end, just to make sure we still want it here. But for now, you could remove it from this. If you're going to keep this function, though, we should call super setup player input component, which we weren't doing. That would be good to do. And we want to pass in our player input component. This is just calling the parent function. The parent of SSB template character is a character, and we probably want to do any behavior that's already being done in there. So even though we weren't doing it to this point in the series, it is something I recommend. Now going back to base PlayerController.cpp, we want to go down to our functions, and now we want to get the pawn and check to see if it's of a certain type, and then call the corresponding function. There's, again, other ways you could handle this as well, but this is the most basic way. A good thing to do is just have an if statement to see if this player controller is possessing a pawn. You could either make a variable, something like possess pawn, set it, make sure it's valid before using the input, or you could get the pawn every time. Since we are pressing a lot of inputs, it might be a little bit less efficient to find the pawn every time. I'm sure we'll be going over this more in the future, but essentially it will look like this. A pawn, pointer, pawn, and we'll call it actually controlled or possessed pawn equals get pawn. We put this in an if statement because if this function returns a pawn pointer, this means this is the pawn that it's controlling. If it returns null pointer, it's not controlling a pawn. So this player controller is not possessing a character. If it's not possessing a character, we don't want to do anything. But if it is, possessed pawn will be valid. And at that point, we could cast it to our particular type to see what function we should call. And we can do that right here. So cast a SSB template character. And we're casting get pawn. And if this succeeds, that means we have our SSB template character. And then we can call possessed pawn jump. Now, we don't have the type in here that we need, the include, to call this function. So we need to include SSB template character up at the top. Include SSB template character.h. Now coming back down here, possess pawn, jump. And the reason we can't call this is because now that we're casting this to an SSB template character, it's not just a pawn, and it's not even just a character either. This would be of type a SSB template character. And once we do this, we should have this. However, the function isn't really jump. That's the parent, the a character function call for jump. The SSB template character function is called start jump. Now, we probably can't call this here because it's protected, and yes, it's inaccessible. So if we go to SSB template character.h and scroll down to this function or search for it with Control F, we can go to where all of our functions here, start jump, stop, start crouch, and see where they're at. And you'll notice that they are in the protected space. So this means we can't call them from another class that's not a child or a friend class. So in this case, we want to find all of our functions in the character class. Move right controller, or two of them. And we want to move them up here to the public section. So scroll back down. We have start jump and stop jump. I'm going to keep them in the same order as the player controller has them with the mappings. So we have start crouch and stop crouch. We have basic attack, basic smash attack, special held attack. Then we have our debug take damage as well, which I believe is actually after stop crouch. Then we have our grab, start blocking, stop taunt. and exit revival platform. There we go. And now all of our functions that we want to call from the player controller are going to be public. We do have a public section down below. I like to put my public functions and variables at the top. You don't have to move all of them now. You can have different sections in one. Again, just personal preference. But you can either type public here or just find another public section and put them in here. Once they're in this section, we can then go back to the base player controller and you'll see that we can call start jump. And we're really going to do the same thing for all of these. If you don't want to get the pawn every time, like I mentioned, you can make a possessed pawn variable, set it as soon as you get possessed. You still probably will want to check it when you're calling these functions. And then if you unpossess that pawn, reset this to null pointer. But otherwise, we just want to call the corresponding function. So release up is going to be stop jump. Press down is going to be start crouch. Release down is going to be stop crouch. Press insert is going to be debug take damage. Press basic attack is going to be basic attack. Release basic attack is actually going to be basic smash attack. Special attack is going to be special attack. And release special attack is going to be special held attack. Press grab is going to be grab. Press block is going to be start blocking. Release block is going to be stop blocking. Press taunt is going to be taunt. Start taunt, actually. Press any input is going to be exit revival platform. Capture right axis is going to be move right, and it is going to pass in the value that is passed into this function. Capture right axis controller is going to be move right controller, passing in the value passed into this function. At this point, all of our events are set up properly. Now let's go ahead and test this out by launching our game. The editor is back open, so if we play our game, first question is, can we jump? And we can. Can I stop jumping? I can. Can I start crouching? Can I stop crouching? I can. Can I move right? Yes, I can. Can I use my different attacks, my block, my grab? And yes, it looks like I can. I can fast fall. If I jump off the map and hit the barrier, can I exit the revival platform early? I can. So all my inputs appear to be working, and they're also working for the other characters. However, the other characters use that keyboard mode hack that I was talking about. So to really make this work, what you should do is add that little if statement that we commented out above so that we can still do things like jump. If we don't do that, they won't be overridden by the blueprint inputs. And I can show you where these are if we go to our character blueprint. Base character BP. We have all of these keyboard inputs that we're mapping, like jump does this on the specific character. These won't be put into effect if they're bound in the code. We could improve this, and we likely will in the series, but for now, just transferring this over will be enough. So if we go ahead and uncomment this, and we can take away that comment here, put everything inside of these curly braces, all of our bindings, that is. Now you'll notice that we're getting errors for our SSB template game mode, and you know what that means. We need to include it up here. So we go to the include list, include SSB template game mode.h. And now we've included it. Now the type is found. At this point, you won't be able to control any of your other characters outside of the first character, but that's fine for now. Feel free to keep it as is. That way we have our logic set up in here. And then as we improve this player controller in the next episode on the player controllers, I'll show you how to handle this properly with our new setup. I hope you enjoyed this episode on moving your inputs from your character to your controller, so you can see the benefits of doing so, being able to possess multiple pawns with the same controller but do different logic depending on which pawn is being possessed, or if you have a menu open, so on and so forth. If you enjoyed and you want to support the channel, then please subscribe. It does more for myself and the community than anything else you can do, and I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for all who have and everyone who has supported the Patreon, YouTube membership, or Discord subscriptions to help boost this channel up and support the series time after time. I'm really grateful for you guys. If you ran into any problems following this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. There is a link in the description, and I would be happy to help you out. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.